for inviting me to speak, and I'm sorry that I'm going to have to get off after this because it is the middle of the night here. But it's good to see you all. It's also good to have a political discussion in English rather than French. Finally, I'll be able to, well, at least you'll be able to understand what I'm trying to say, which is a good thing. So I just came from a big meeting put on by some of our comrades over here in the new anti-capitalist party with the far left, which was a meeting against the war that's gearing up and the repression that has really become quite unbelievable here. And it was very impressive. I mean, there were 400 people, I would say, about, give or take. And various different groups from the far left were represented there, and our comrade Olivier Besancenot, who is a very prominent figure on the far left here, two-time presidential candidate, was certainly was in rare form. He was excellent. On the other hand, it was definitely noticeable that it was very much the far left that was out tonight, generally, I would say that the political climate is not one that it is not a good climate here right now. On Sunday, there was an attempt to break the ban on demonstrations, on protests, which has been instituted, which has now been extended for several months with the vote in the French Parliament to extend the state of emergency, and several hundred people came out for a protest in defense of refugees, a major issue right now here in France. And people weren't sure how the police were going to react to the protest. And while the protest did go ahead, and there were no arrests at the demonstration, afterwards, the police forwarded the names of 58 people that they had identified from, we think, from video of the march, to the local prefecture for some form of judicial punishment. We're not sure what. So yesterday morning at 6 o'clock, 58 people from the left got visits at their house from the police, issuing them summons for having appeared at this demonstration. And that gives a little bit of a taste of the climate of repression and of fear right now. It's pretty difficult to describe, frankly, just how bad it's getting. The vote in the parliament to extend the state of emergency for the next 3 months, I mean, to give you a sense, this is a measure that gives the police the right to conduct warrantless searches, to detain people without charge, gives the Interior Ministry the right to shut down websites unilaterally that it decides are justifying or somehow excusing the attacks that happened. This was a vote. There are 900 people between the National Assembly and the Senate, 900 representatives, give or take, in the French Parliament. There were 6 votes total against the extension for 3 months of the state of emergency. 6 total. And there are several more abstentions than that, but it really is one in which in general, the climate of repression is quite intense. And we have to say, that this is, I mean, if the goal of ISIS, and I believe it was, in many ways, was to intensify a state of insecurity, really the repression in French society, to polarize French society and Europe. In general, they really succeeded. It's a climate right now where 90% of the population supported the extension of the state of emergency, and supports the expansion of police powers. The people are really scared. I mean, there was this attack that targeted neighborhoods right around where I'm sitting right now, areas right around, which are very, they're mixed neighborhoods. The neighborhood, you look outside my window, I live right up the street where some of the attacks happened. This is a largely Arab and Asian immigrant area, a working class area. These were totally random areas that were targeted by these attacks, and people are, they're really quite nervous. And they've used this, the French government, predictably, on the one hand, to expand what promises to be a major intensification of France's role in the war on terror, and just to say the Hollande government, the Socialist Party government, the sort of social democratic government that's been in power since 2012, already has been expanding the scope of France's military presence all over Africa and the Middle East over the last few years. They've really expanded France's relationship with, for example, the Gulf states, selling them weapons, bombing campaigns in Mali, and they've taken a lead in attacking Syria. Well, obviously they're using this to ramp up the war on Syria, and what promises to be quite a drawn-out expansion of the war on terror. And then domestically, there's a real escalation of the repression directed particularly at the working class, largely immigrant, lots of people of color areas that surround the suburbs around Paris. Already there's been over 1,000 searches conducted using the new anti-terrorism measures, or the state of emergency, according to the government. People might have seen the standoff in Saint-Denis, which is a big, very, very heavily Arab and black working class area north of Paris, with a long tradition of working class organization, of left governance, and they went after some of the people who organized the attacks, but the police dragnet caught up lots of people who live in the area. In fact, out of the 8 people that they arrested, it seems that 7 of them had nothing to do with who lived in that building where they targeted. 7 of them had nothing to do with the attack. Some of the people who got arrested, who got dragged out by the police, in their underwear. First thing in the morning, they got horribly wounded and sent to hospital. And it turns out they're just lots of undocumented workers who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and getting deported right now. And it's an awful climate. The far-right National Front, which has been making real gains in the last couple of years, is obviously trying to use this. One of the things they said about Saint-Denis was, because it has a history of left-wing governance, was that this is what happens, that this is the problems. The left let the terrorists come in and take over these working-class suburbs around Paris, and the state needs to go in and clean things up. And that really is the way that they're trying to use this. So it's something that it's a climate in which there is going to be a lot of attempts to justify some real vicious repression in the coming weeks and the coming months. And it's going to be very difficult for our climate for our comrades who are in different groups on the far left, in different areas of the far left. And it's going to be one that's going to be very difficult for them to withstand, and so they deserve a lot of respect for the work that they're trying to do. I would say that a couple of things that I think are if not hopeful, that at least points. It's something that you can point to, that you could say it's not all. I mean, it's pretty bad. I don't want to, but there are things that you can point to. You could say there may be some potential here. One thing that's really good is the CGT union, the largest union federation in France, one that traditionally has been associated with the left, came out with what I think, given the climate, was an excellent statement about the situation. Really, as much as possible, I would say, opposing the war, opposing the attacks on civil liberties, saying that we aren't going to accept a sort of social peace that is going to be used to attack workers in the name of national unity. And they had already called a day of action next Tuesday around these workers at Air France. I don't know if people saw this, who are 5 workers got fired because after the company announced major layoffs, they invaded a meeting and ripped off the shirts of 2 human resources officials at the company. So their company was trying to fire them. There was a day of action that was already scheduled for next Tuesday. They said they are not canceling that day of action, and that is something that I think is very exciting. We'll see what happens with that. They have announced, the government unilaterally announced the cancellation of the big demonstrations that were planned for the coming climate march, and And I think that that was something that they were able to do without much of a political backlash. We'll see if there's still actions that develop around that. There's some talk of things happening. The biggest thing, I think, and there have been some critical voices in the media, few and far between. I mean, the French media is quite bad right now, and they're giving a lot of space to some very prominent voices who are saying things like, not only should we be bombing Syria, we should be bombing the areas in Brussels, in Belgium, where some of the organizers of the attack came through. I mean, that's the tenor of the media right now. If people saw my article in Jacobin that came out right after the attack, I go through some of the initial responses, and people have a sense of just how bad things are. There are some critical voices, and I would say that I think in the long run, there is potential for the left to put forward an argument. And I don't think it'll be easy, but I think that there's some possibility of doing this, of putting forward an argument that says, look, after the last 15 years, after the whole experience of the war on terror, do we really think that more bombing, which inevitably is going to kill innocent people in Syria, this is going to stop this from happening again? I mean, I do think that there is going to be some space to say that, and certainly, at home, there's a real ramping up of the racism. I hope that at a certain point there is going to be space to say, if ISIS's goal was anything, it was to intensify a climate of racism, of repression that polarizes what is a very segregated French society, already very segregated French society, in a way that isolates most people. In Muslim, France is quite a big Muslim population, which faces a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination, which isolates them, which isolates people in working class areas, isolates people in Arab and Black communities. And Paris is a very heavily immigrant city, a very international city. A lot of people who are immigrants or their children from France's post-colonial empire. But ISIS's goal is to isolate those people further from the rest of French society. And the more that there is this ramping up of repression, the more there is police violence directed at these communities, the more in the long run you are going to create a climate in which things like this happen again. Far from preventing these, you're going to create a climate in which all of this happens. So I hope that in the long run there's space to make those arguments. Just to say, the last 2 weeks for people on the left here have been, they've been very difficult. They've been very demoralizing. I mean, there was a lot of people who died in these attacks last week. I was with some friends who had just gone to a memorial service for a comrade who was killed at the Bataclan at the theater. And someone that they'd known for a long time, who had been in the LCR, in the Ligue communiste révolutionnaire, in the Revolutionary Communist League, someone who was known for translating David Harvey's work into French. I mean, it was a lot of progressive people who were killed in these attacks. And what's come after is really it's a climate that people are really nervous about. And so I don't think I just want to make sure that. I mean, probably people already have a sense of this, but it's a difficult climate, and it's one in which it's going to take some time, and it's going to take a lot of work, to start to overcome. And we can hope that those little points of hope, those little rays of sunshine, but I don't know what the right metaphor is. The little spaces that maybe you can see right now, we could start to open those up, but that is not something that is going to happen immediately. So I hope I didn't demoralize everyone too much, but I wanted to give people a picture of where things stand, and I hope you guys have a good discussion about it.
Hi. That's sobering. I wanted to say something about something that Jonah just said, which I am processing as I'm speaking, and that when he talks about the calling of the bombing of these neighborhoods in Belgium, we are talking, just to give you, I have family in Belgium, in Brussels, and I lived in Paris. in the late 80s and have been back many times. It's sort of, the equivalent would be calling for the bombing of Bay Ridge or Astoria in Queens. We're talking about large immigrant neighborhoods. That's essentially what is being called for. So here comes the puppies and rainbows part of the conversation, huh? Not really. The attacks on Paris on Friday, November the 13th, were really, in some ways, I think, a poor man's shock and awe. I like the way Lami Sandoni puts it. She calls it a clash of barbarisms going on. I think that's an appropriate way of putting it. And I agree with all of those who demand that we take the Beirut killings the day before in those horrific bombings that killed 43, 44, I believe might be the latest count, or just the other day in Mali, the massacre and the daily killings in Iraq and in Syria just as seriously as we do the attacks in Paris. At the same time, I think there is, of course, a certain message being sent by the attacks right in the center of an imperial power like France. By going to the heart of a European capital, these attackers are saying that we can and will strike empires. And I think Jonah, in his piece that first appeared in Jacobin and again in socialistworker.org, raises a crucial point about the specific targets of the attacks. Regular people, working class people in many parts. We are not talking about these are not the Plaza Hotel, this is not where the rich and the posh, this is not Wall Street, this is not any of those sort of symbolically significant places, multicultural areas, even many progressives who would feel at home in this room tonight would have frequented the places that were the targets of these attacks. I have to say, like many people who've spent time in Paris, I spent much of that night up on social media, and the first thing I Googled was my address, and the first thing that came up was a tweet of bodies outside my old apartment building, because I discovered that the bar I used to hang out on up the block from my apartment on Rue de Charonne in the 11th district around the corner from the Bastille was where 19 people were murdered at La Belle Équipe. It was called something else when I lived there, but it was a bar where we would go after this meeting. This was the kind of place that was attacked. And I think, it's significant to point out because it says something about the nature and the plan. And I want to talk about some of that as well as what I believe the US has afoot, as well as some of the other powers. And there's no way in the world that in 20 minutes or so I'm going to cover everything. So I'll try and touch on some of these things. But I will say at that bar that was attacked, I was thinking about it a lot this last week, and one of the conversations that I had, because I used to hang out there with North African friends who lived up the block from me, and one of them, Hassan, told me in that bar, actually, of an incident that happened in Paris years before. One of the things that has been repeated over and over again this last 10 days or whatever it's been, has been that this is the worst attacks since World War II. That is not true. That is not true. This is not the worst massacre in Paris since World War II. There is another incident one should be reminded of in particular at this moment. On October 17th in 1961, the head of police in Paris, a fellow by the name of Papon, ordered the police forces to attack a demonstration, a peaceful demonstration of 30,000, mostly Algerians, protesting in the center of Paris against what at that point had been a 7-year war by France to defend its occupation of Algeria. 30,000 people hit the streets of Paris, and on that day, the police beat and murdered, and often by throwing, after they beat them to unconsciousness, they threw them off a bridge, Saint-Michel, into the Seine. It is estimated that somewhere in excess of 200 people were murdered that day by the police forces in Paris. That has not even been acknowledged until the last couple of years, and even in the acknowledgement of it, the official acknowledgement, I think, says something like 40 people were killed, which leaves many hundreds of families grieving without any redress from the government. I say this only to say that this is the first of many lies in a narrative that will emerge from these attacks. I think we have to ask, what is the goal of these attacks? It's a legitimate question that everyone is asking. Why not us on the left? It seems to me that the perpetrators of the attack were trying to create some sort of unbridgeable divide between Arabs, or at least Muslims, many of whom might wish to integrate into larger Western society, have for many years or decades or even generations integrated into larger Western society, and the rest of the world, including we on the left, including progressives, anti-imperialists, and those of us who would happily welcome refugees among us, which of course raises the question, why? Why would they want this? And I think, at least in part, and I can only, of course, conjecture, that they were trying to get exactly the response that they have gotten. Exactly the response that the Congress of the United States, that the government of France, that these lickspittle governors of tin pot states that very few of us would want to live in, no less, I'm sure, Syrian immigrants, have put out, and that is they would like to create an absolute wall between Muslims and the rest of the world. They want to make life hell in the West for Muslims, to stoke racism and xenophobia in the hopes of driving Muslims into the arms of ISIS and their ilk. And I think we now have a pretty disastrous situation, both in Europe and in the United States, where despite the fact here that 750,000 refugees have settled in the United States since the attacks on September 11th, not one incident of terror from any one of these 750,000 people, and yet 54% of the American population today polled oppose letting in any more refugees. They have succeeded on that ideological front for now. Foreign policy experts confirm that ISIS today is the world's richest terror group, reaping millions of dollars a day from selling stolen oil to shady businessmen in the Middle East. And I think it's worth us having a bit of a conversation about ISIS, and not just ISIS, because there's a bit of attention that is placed in mainstream media on ISIS, I believe, to deflect attention away from other forces that are in some ways more culpable. But let us have a conversation about ISIS. It is not verboten here. There's a very interesting interview, I think, with Arun Kundnani, who is the author of the book, The Muslims Are Coming. And I found a couple of insights in particular worth citing here. He talks about the growth of ISIS not just being about sort of religious fervor. We've all heard in the last week or so about the supposed mastermind of the attacks in Paris, a fellow by the name of Abdelhamid Abaoud, who, according to his ex-girlfriend, which I have to say is not necessarily the most reliable source, but okay, according to his ex-girlfriend, he was someone who was known to have a few too many whiskeys, smoke a lot of pot, basically not the profile of what one would imagine would be a mastermind inside of ISIS. But it very much parallels what we have seen among many people who have come to Syria as volunteers to join ISIS over the last 2 years of its existence. And that is a large number of people from Europe whose families came from the Arab world with copies of Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies, literally under their arms. In other words, people who are not themselves deeply schooled or deeply attached to these ideas, but just sort of cramming for their new lives. And I think, which is not to say that ISIS is just simply a front of readers of ISIS for Dummies or whatever. I'm sure there's one of those books on its way from Amazon. But it's to say that Arabs and Muslims living under conditions of racism and really neoliberal crapification, this sort of you're on your own, everything is privatized, don't expect anything from the state, no public services, all the rest of it, especially in the wake of the counter-revolutions in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere, means that many of these young men and increasingly women are drawn to a sort of apocalyptic vision. As Arun puts it, and I'll quote him here, the narrative of global war against the West feels to its adherents like an answer to the violence of racism, poverty, and empire. And I think that is an important statement because we have to begin to understand what is the politics of groupings like this. If we just absorb the narrative coming from the mainstream media, from the corporate media, you would think that they're just sort of like bizarro figures from some sort of medieval fascist notion. I do think they are their politics are absolutely horrid, but we do have to wrap our heads around what the content of them are, the content of their politics are, rather than simply dismiss it out of hand. Another crucial point that Arun makes is that ISIS is a child of globalism, of globalization. Its use of social media, it is estimated to have something like 50,000 Twitter handles, Facebook pages up the yin-yang. They are frequent users of Yik Yak, which I've literally had to ask a young friend what the hell that is. I understand it leaves no footprint behind. It's basically a social media forum in which people can communicate much more anonymously. All the rest of that, as well as its ties to the global oil economy, show how ISIS is basically a monster of our own creation. I want to say something about the roots of ISIS because too little is said of it in the corporate media. ISIS was formally established in Syria in the fall of 2013. It is literally a 2-year-old organization. It basically formed out of the splits and collapse of Al-Qaeda, or semi-collapse of Al-Qaeda. I'm sure it will metastasize into something else as well. The roots of ISIS begin really with the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. But even before this, you need to actually look at the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and its consequences on Iraqi society, because some of the very same commanders of ISIS today are actually ex-Ba'athists. That was the name of the political party that Saddam Hussein was the head of. They are ex-Ba'athists from Saddam's army. So there's the role of Saddam Hussein, the Saddam Hussein dictatorship, in the formation, the US invasion of Iraq, the destruction of Iraqi society in 2003, and definitely, absolutely, the establishment of the sectarian state after that. The role of the Iraqi government's sectarian policies, particularly under Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, which is basically the US's man in Iraq and has been from 2006 to 2014, their role towards the Sunni population really played a very important role, and along with the support of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Lebanese Shia Islamic movement, Hezbollah, also trained Iraqi sectarian Shia militia that committed massacres against the Sunni population there. ISIS funds themselves essentially by selling oil, stolen and otherwise, taxing people, selling archaeological pieces and various other stuff that they've plundered. ISIS is essentially a mafia-style company in terms of business and its self-funding. I want to go on to say a little something about what, I want to move on from there, about, let's see, what the US aims to get out of all of this. I think the US would prefer in the region the pre-2011 imperial status quo. That is clearly what the US would ultimately desire. That train has left the station. That ain't coming back. However, they will settle for very limited change. And by that I mean the same position that the US has taken in all of the revolutionary processes throughout the Middle East. That is, limiting any kind of radical change from below, maintaining regimes, perhaps with the head cut off, but what we would call the deep state left essentially intact, just as we have seen in Egypt, where Mubarak is removed and then now taken out of jail and sort of rehabilitated on some level, but with the body of the state machinery completely intact. The same thing can be said for Tunisia. In fact, the same thing can be said for Yemen and other regimes. The US wants no threats to its most important ally in the region, Israel. Absolutely. This means not threatening the monarchies of the Gulf, which have actually, in a bizarro world that we live in, been sotto voce supporters of the State of Israel. It means cutting a deal with Iran, which they effectively have. The US will allow Iran to play a role to stabilize the region. And we can see that today. There's a kind of deal between the US and Iran in which it comes, when it comes to the Islamic State in Iraq. The US and Iran basically collaborated when it came to Afghanistan in 2001, in Iraq in 2003, and these regional and international players want an end to the revolutionary processes. That is effectively their end goal. Anything to secure the free flow of oil, any kind of stability by any means necessary, which explains the ongoing relationship with the Saudi regime and all the other reactionary regimes of the Middle East. And I think we have to also take account of the fact that while ISIS deserves all level of condemnation that the left and anyone else can place on it, it must be said that the overwhelming majority of people in Syria, or for that matter in Iraq, their lives are not primarily immiserated by ISIS forces. They are immiserated by the regimes that are in place, essentially the Assad regime. According to the only reliable figures that exist inside of Syria, which is a group called the Syrian Network for Human Rights, which actually exists on the ground, 85% of all civilian casualties, of all civilian deaths inside of Syria are caused by the Assad regime bombing its own population. ISIS does not have the capability to do that kind of damage, doesn't have the reach, doesn't have the force, doesn't have the size. That is only something that the Assad regime exclusively holds. And I think that, I don't have time to get into it here, but I do believe that there is a problem that we have on the left globally in which you have sections of the left actually siding, believing that the Assad regime is somehow a counterpoint to ISIS and actually choosing what they perceive to be a lesser evil in this circumstance, which is really siding with a sub-imperial power against its own population, which we will have none of here in this room. I think that the latest Russian airstrikes are really serving as a cover. Iranian troops may well actually join the Lebanese Hezbollah fighters alongside of Assad's government force in a sort of escalating war. Assad's government at this point only controls about 25% of the entire territory of what was formerly Syria. Syria is a country of 22 million people in which literally half of its population is on the move, internally displaced, or now, as we are coming to see, as they finally reached and these, of course, are probably the most middle-class elements, the most intrepid elements, the most healthy elements among the Syrian population who have managed to reach the borders of Europe, and the handful who've actually managed to make their way to the United States in literal handfuls. I saw somebody post something earlier today about how New York City has in total taken four Syrian refugees since the beginning of this crisis. So let's get down to it. I think ultimately what we are seeing play out right now, today's attacks, first from Turkey on a Russian warplane at the border, and now Russia's retort, almost inevitable. We are seeing inter-imperialist rivalry on the order of what we have not seen really since the early part of the 20th century. Whether this will lead to the kind of all-out global conflagration, I don't know we kind of already are in that. It's not going to look the same 100 years later. I think we're kind of at war without it actually being declared. But we have some work to do. Comrades, we have some work to do on the left. I believe that our central demands have to be primarily protests to demand that the U.S. allow the refugees in. I think the kinds of things that were initiated last weekend in Boston, where nearly 2,000 people showed up to protest and brought together forces, like many of the people in this room and the friends and the colleagues and the various individuals and groups that we're connected with, that needs to be repeated in every major city and not so major city around the United States. I think centrally, absolutely, we have got to end the wars and occupations throughout the Middle East. So long as the U.S. forces remain, whether it's 100 or whether it's 1,000, whether we call them advisors or whether we call them mercenaries, whether they wear U.S. armed forces uniforms or whether they are wearing the garb of Blackwater or whatever the hell Blackwater is calling itself this week, we have to call for their complete and utter removal. And finally, I think we have to call for the absolute end stopping of support of reactionary regimes that are fueling the terror, chiefly Saudi Arabia and Israel. Those are the primary reactionary regimes. We have, as the French revolutionary Daniel Ben Said said, l'obligation inéluctable d'agir, the unavoidable obligation to act, despite no guarantees of success. But let's be absolutely and completely clear who is ultimately behind all of this. We don't need anti-encryption software. We don't need NSA capabilities to find out where they live. We know exactly where the source of terror in our world comes from. Their addresses are these. Take a note. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. 10 Downing Street, London, Britain. Élysée Palace, Paris, France, and most certainly the Kremlin in Moscow. If we go after those addresses, and I'm not talking about bombs, I'm talking about protests, popular dissidents, about people going after the root of the problem, that is where we can have an impact, because those are the people who are at the heart of the problem, not these little scattered groups who are forming also. They will disband, and they will cease to be a pole of attraction for people who are feeling completely under siege with nowhere to go if these things are done, if the wars are ended, if the refugees are allowed in, and if our support for reactionary regimes in the Middle East cease tomorrow.